Lieutenant Kate Morrison walked through the heavy metal doors of Facility 7 on Europa and felt nothing but disgust. This prison sat on one of Jupiter's frozen moons and housed 300 men who she believed deserved to be here. Kate was 52 years old with blonde hair that she kept tied back in a tight bun. Her face showed lines from years of frowning and judging others. She had grown up in New Atlanta Colony, where people were separated by skin color, and she learned to hate anyone who looked different from her. Her parents taught her that some people were better than others, and she never questioned it. Now she worked as a prison guard and treated the inmates like they were less than human. She had been fired from her last job on Mars for being too rough with prisoners, but she lied about it to get this position. Europa was her last chance to work in the prison system, and she knew it, but she did not plan to change who she was. Warden Phillips sat behind his desk and looked at Kate with tired eyes. He was an older man who seemed sad about something. Through his office window, Kate could see the prisoners moving around in the common area. They walked in organized lines and followed the rules. This surprised her because she expected them to act like animals. The warden opened her file on his computer screen and frowned. He told her that her record showed many complaints about excessive force. The complaints had all been dismissed, but the pattern worried him. Kate felt her jaw tighten with anger. She told him that she maintained order, and that was what mattered in a prison. The warden shook his head slowly and said that order without humanity was just tyranny. He said these men had made mistakes, but they were still human beings, and she needed to remember that. Kate wanted to argue with him, but she held her tongue. She needed this job desperately. Her reputation in the prison system was already damaged, and if she lost this position, she would have nowhere else to go. But she had no intention of treating these criminals with kindness or respect. The facility was different from other prisons Kate had worked in. The walls were made of thick steel to protect against Europa's harsh environment. Outside the prison, the moon's surface was covered in ice, and the atmosphere would kill a person in seconds. Inside the prison, everything was controlled by computers and airlocks. The inmates wore gray jumpsuits with numbers on the back. Most of them were black men from Earth who had been arrested under laws that seemed designed to put them in prison. Kate did not care about why they were here. To her, they were just criminals who deserved punishment. She spent her first day walking through the different sections and watching the inmates with cold eyes. She noticed that they looked at her with caution. Some of them whispered to each other when she passed by. She knew they could sense her hatred, and that made her feel powerful. She liked being feared. On her third day, Kate was assigned to supervise the recreation area. The inmates were allowed 2 hours of free time each day, and they used it to exercise or talk with each other. Kate stood by the wall with her arms crossed and watched them with suspicion. She assumed they were planning something violent or trying to break the rules, but what she saw confused her. The men played basketball and lifted weights and read books. They talked quietly and laughed sometimes. They seemed like normal people having a normal day. This made Kate uncomfortable because it did not match what she believed about them. She had been taught that criminals were dangerous and violent all the time. Seeing them act peacefully made her angry because it challenged her worldview. She decided they were just pretending to be good and that their true nature would show eventually. During her first week, Kate met the other guards who worked at Facility 7. Most of them were younger than her, and they treated the inmates with basic respect. 2 guards named Kenny White and Lisa Park seemed particularly soft in Kate's opinion. They talked to the prisoners like they were people and sometimes even joked with them. Kate thought this was weak and dangerous. She believed that guards should maintain distance and authority at all times. One afternoon, she overheard Kenny and Lisa talking about her in the break room. Kenny said she treated the inmates like animals. Lisa replied that maybe Kate needed time to adjust to how things worked at this facility. Kate felt rage building in her chest, but she said nothing. She did not care what these young guards thought about her methods. She had been doing this job for 30 years, and she was not going to change now. The inmates quickly learned to avoid Kate. When she walked through the corridors, they moved out of her way without making eye contact. She spoke to them in harsh tones and gave orders with contempt in her voice. If anyone moved too slowly, she would shout at them or threaten them with punishment. The other guards noticed her behavior, but no one confronted her directly. Warden Phillips called her into his office twice during the first week to discuss complaints. He told her that the facility operated on a rehabilitation model and that her aggressive approach was not acceptable. Kate nodded and pretended to agree, but inside she felt only resentment. She thought the warden was weak for caring about the feelings of criminals. As soon as she left his office, she went back to treating the inmates exactly as she had before. Late one evening, Kate sat alone in the guard station and watched the security monitors. The screens showed different areas of the prison. In one camera view, she could see several inmates sitting together in a common room. They were talking and one of them was reading from a book. In another view, she saw men cleaning the kitchen area and working together efficiently. In a third view, she saw an inmate helping another one with what looked like homework or studying. Kate stared at these images and felt confusion mixed with anger. These scenes did not match the story she had been told her entire life. She had been raised to believe that black people were lazy and violent and criminal by nature, but what she saw on these monitors showed people who were organized and helpful and peaceful. For a brief moment, Kate felt a crack in her beliefs. What if she had been wrong about everything? What if the people who raised her had lied to her? But then she pushed these thoughts away violently. She could not afford to question herself now. Admitting she was wrong would mean accepting that she had spent 30 years hurting innocent people. That was too painful to consider. So she hardened her heart and told herself that what she saw on the monitors was just an act. She convinced herself that these men were still dangerous criminals who deserved her contempt. This lie was easier to accept than the truth. The morning of Kate's second week at Facility 7 brought her face to face with Marcus Cole for the first time. Marcus was 41 years old and had been in prison for 12 years. He was tall with broad shoulders and calm eyes that seemed to see through people. The other inmates respected him and often came to him for advice. Kate learned from the guard roster that Marcus was serving 20 years for resisting arrest during a protest. She did not bother to read the details of his case because she assumed he was guilty and violent, like she believed all the inmates were. During the morning inspection, Kate walked through the cell blocks with her flashlight checking each room. When she reached Marcus's cell, he was sitting on his bed reading a book. She banged on the bars with her flashlight to make him look up. Marcus slowly put down his book and stood at attention as the rules required. Kate stared at him with undisguised hatred. She told him his cell was messy and that he needed to clean it immediately. Marcus looked around his cell, which was spotless, and then looked back at Kate. His expression showed no anger or fear, just a kind of sad recognition. He told her respectfully that his cell met all facility standards. Kate felt rage at being contradicted. She told him not to talk back to her and threatened him with solitary confinement. Marcus said nothing more, but his eyes held a look that disturbed Kate deeply. It was not hatred or resentment, but something worse. It was disappointment, as if he had expected her to be better than she was and found exactly what he anticipated. Kate turned away quickly and moved to the next cell, but Marcus's expression stayed in her mind for hours afterward. Later that day, Kate supervised the work detail in the prison workshop. The inmates used this space to repair equipment and make furniture that was sold to other colonies. Marcus was assigned to the workshop along with 7 other men. Kate stood near the door watching them work. The men moved efficiently and worked together without needing much supervision. Marcus seemed to be the informal leader. He organized the work and made sure everyone knew their tasks. Kate noticed that the other inmates listened to him and followed his suggestions without question. This bothered her because she believed criminals should not have any authority or respect. She decided to challenge Marcus in front of the others to show them who was really in charge. She walked over to where Marcus was cutting metal and told him he was working too slowly. Marcus stopped and looked at her calmly. He told her that he was working at the regulation pace set by the facility safety guidelines. Kate told him she did not care about guidelines and that he needed to work faster. Marcus replied that working faster would be dangerous and could cause accidents. Kate felt her anger rising. She told him that if he refused to follow her orders, she would write him up for insubordination. The workshop became very quiet. All the other inmates had stopped working and were watching the confrontation. Marcus looked at Kate for a long moment and then nodded slowly. He said he would file a formal complaint with the warden about her order to violate safety protocols, but that he would comply under protest. Kate realized she had made a mistake. If Marcus filed a complaint and the warden investigated, he would find that Kate was wrong. She backed down by telling Marcus to just get back to work, and then she left the workshop quickly. She heard the men start working again behind her, and she knew they were talking about what had just happened. She felt humiliated, and her humiliation turned into deeper hatred. That evening, Kate sat in the guard break room eating dinner alone. Kenny and Lisa came in and sat at another table. They talked quietly, but Kate could hear parts of their conversation. Kenny said that Kate had tried to make Marcus violate safety rules, and that Marcus had handled it perfectly by staying calm and citing regulations. Lisa said that Kate seemed determined to provoke the inmates into giving her an excuse to punish them. Kenny replied that someone should report her behavior before she caused a serious incident. Kate felt her face burning with shame and anger. These young guards did not understand how dangerous these criminals were. They were too soft and too trusting. Kate believed that the inmates were just waiting for a chance to hurt someone, and that strict control was the only way to keep them in line. She thought about confronting Kenny and Lisa, but decided against it. Making enemies of the other guards would only make her situation worse. Instead, she finished her meal in silence and left the break room without speaking to anyone. Over the following days, Kate found herself thinking about Marcus more than she wanted to. His calm demeanor and quiet dignity bothered her in ways she could not fully explain. She had spent her entire career dealing with prisoners who either cowered in fear or responded with violence. Marcus did neither. He followed the rules perfectly and treated everyone, including Kate, with basic respect. But he also refused to be intimidated or demeaned. This combination confused Kate because it did not fit into her simple view of how criminals should behave. She started watching Marcus more closely during her shifts. She noticed that other inmates came to him with problems and that he always took time to listen and offer advice. She saw him breaking up arguments before they became fights. She observed him teaching younger inmates how to use the workshop equipment safely. Everything she saw contradicted what she believed about criminals and especially about black men. Kate tried to find evidence that Marcus was dangerous or dishonest. She searched his cell multiple times looking for contraband or rule violations. She reviewed his disciplinary record and found it was nearly spotless except for the arrest that brought him here. She even read his case file finally and learned that he had been leading a peaceful protest when corporate security forces attacked the protesters. Marcus had been convicted of assault for defending other protesters from being beaten. The security forces who actually started the violence were never charged. This information disturbed Kate because it suggested that Marcus might be innocent. But she pushed these thoughts away. Accepting that Marcus was innocent would mean accepting that the justice system was corrupt. That was too big and too frightening for Kate to consider. 3 weeks into her assignment, Kate was supervising recreation time when an incident occurred. 2 younger inmates got into an argument over a basketball game. The argument escalated quickly and they started pushing each other. Kate reached for her shock baton, ready to hurt both of them. But before she could move, Marcus stepped between the 2 men. He put a hand on each of their shoulders and spoke to them quietly. Kate could not hear what he said, but both men immediately calmed down. They apologized to each other and shook hands. The potential fight was over in less than 30 seconds. Kate stood there with her shock baton in hand, feeling confused and angry. Marcus had resolved the situation peacefully when Kate had been ready to use violence. The other inmates had seen it happen. They had seen that Marcus's way worked better than Kate's way. This made Kate feel weak and foolish. She walked over to Marcus and told him to mind his own business. Marcus looked at her with those same calm eyes and said that preventing violence was everyone's business. He said it was especially important in a place like this where violence only led to more violence. Kate wanted to argue, but she had no good response. She told Marcus to get back to his activities, and then she retreated to her post by the wall. For the rest of the recreation period, she watched Marcus and felt something she had not felt in years. She felt uncertain about herself and her beliefs. That night, Kate lay in her small quarters and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Her mind kept replaying the scene from recreation time. She kept seeing Marcus step between those 2 angry men and calm them with just words. She kept seeing the respect in the other inmates' eyes when they looked at Marcus. She kept feeling the weight of her shock baton in her hand and realizing she had been ready to hurt people when hurting was not necessary. These thoughts made her uncomfortable because they suggested she might be wrong about everything. Kate had built her entire identity on being tough and strong and in control. She had convinced herself that her cruelty was actually strength and that her hatred was actually wisdom. But watching Marcus made her question these beliefs. He was stronger than her without being cruel. He had more control over the situation than her without using violence. He commanded more respect than her without demanding it. Kate felt the foundations of her worldview beginning to crack. She tried to shore them up by reminding herself of all the reasons she had been taught to hate people like Marcus. But for the first time in her life, those reasons sounded hollow and false. She fell asleep finally, but her dreams were troubled by images of Marcus's disappointed eyes looking at her and seeing through all her lies. The breach happened on a Tuesday morning during Kate's fourth week at Facility 7. Europa was always geologically active, but the scientists who monitored the moon's core had not predicted this particular event. A massive volcanic shift deep beneath the ice sent shockwaves through the entire facility. Kate was in Section C conducting a routine inspection with 8 inmates who were assigned to maintenance work in that area. The first tremor knocked her against the wall and made the lights flicker. Emergency alarms started blaring throughout the prison. Kate grabbed her radio and heard Warden Phillips shouting orders to evacuate certain sections. Before she could respond, a second larger tremor hit, and she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the sharp crack of metal tearing. Section C was one of the older parts of the facility, and the outer hull had weak points that engineers had been planning to reinforce. The tremor found those weak points and ripped them open. Yellow gas started pouring into the corridor from the cracks in the wall. Kate recognized it immediately from her safety training. It was a mixture of sulfur dioxide and chlorine from Europa's subsurface ocean. The gas was deadly and would kill anyone who breathed it within minutes. Kate's training took over and she sealed her helmet, which gave her 17 minutes of oxygen. The 8 inmates were not so lucky. They wore basic breathing masks that were designed for dust and minor contaminants, not for toxic gas. Their masks might give them 8 minutes if they were lucky. Kate looked at the emergency bulkhead that separated Section C from the rest of the facility. It should have closed automatically when the breach was detected, but something was wrong. The bulkhead was stuck halfway closed, leaving a gap of about 1 meter. The gap was too small for anyone to squeeze through safely. Kate heard one of the inmates shouting and turned to see Darius Wright at the control panel. Darius was 35 years old and had been a systems engineer before his arrest. He was frantically pressing buttons and pulling levers trying to get the bulkhead to move. He shouted that the hydraulic system was damaged and the bulkhead would not respond to electronic commands. The yellow gas was getting thicker, and Kate could see the inmates starting to cough and struggle to breathe. Her helmet display showed her oxygen level and a countdown timer. She had 17 minutes to make a decision that would determine who lived and who died. Kate's first instinct was pure survival. There was an emergency escape shaft 30 meters down the corridor. If she ran now, she could reach it before her oxygen ran out. The shaft led to a safe zone where other guards could pull her to safety. The inmates could not follow her because they did not have enough air to make the run. They would die here in Section C choking on poison gas. Kate's hand moved to her helmet seal. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to save herself. These men were criminals. They deserved whatever fate brought them. She had no obligation to die for people she despised. Her training said that guard safety came first always. She could leave right now and no one would blame her. The official report would say she barely escaped with her life. She would be called brave for surviving. No one would ever know that she had a choice. But then Kate made the mistake of looking at the inmates. They were not panicking or fighting each other. Instead, they were working together. Darius was still at the control panel trying different combinations to restart the hydraulics. 3 other inmates whose names Kate did not know were using metal bars to try and pry the bulkhead open manually. 2 younger inmates were helping each other put on emergency air tanks from the wall locker, even though everyone knew those tanks only held a few minutes of air. And Marcus was coordinating all of them with calm, clear instructions. He saw Kate standing frozen by the wall and their eyes met. In that moment, Kate saw the same look she had seen before. Disappointment, but not surprise. Marcus had already judged her and found her wanting. He knew she was going to leave them here to die. He had probably known it from the first day they met. Kate felt something break inside her chest. It was not her hatred or her prejudice. Those things were still there as strong as ever. What broke was her ability to keep lying to herself about who she was. Marcus turned away from Kate and went back to directing the other inmates. He was not going to waste time begging for help from someone who had already decided to abandon them. This dismissal hurt Kate more than any insult could have. She looked at her oxygen display again. 15 minutes remaining. She looked at the inmates struggling to open the bulkhead. She looked at the yellow gas getting thicker. She looked at Marcus, who was helping 2 collapsed inmates toward the partial opening in the bulkhead, even though the gap was not wide enough yet. Kate's hands moved to her helmet, and before she could think about what she was doing, she broke the seal and pulled it off. The toxic gas hit her lungs like fire. She started coughing immediately and her eyes began to water and burn. She stumbled toward Marcus and shoved her helmet at him. Her voice came out as a rasp. She told him to take the helmet and get the others through the bulkhead. She would work the manual hydraulics from this side. Marcus stared at her with an expression Kate had never seen on his face before. It was complete shock. He started to argue, but Kate cut him off. She told him this was not a debate or a request. It was an order from a guard to an inmate. She told him to take her helmet and save the others. She told him to hurry because she was not sure how long she could stay conscious. The gas was already making her dizzy and her chest felt like it was being crushed. Marcus took the helmet slowly. He looked at Kate like he was seeing her for the first time. Then he put on the helmet and turned to the other inmates. His voice came through the helmet speaker telling everyone to focus on moving the bulkhead. He said they would all get through this together. Kate wanted to tell him that she was not doing this for them. She was doing it because she could not live with herself if she ran away. But she did not have enough breath left for explanations. Kate made it to the manual hydraulic controls on the wall. The system was old and required physical strength to operate. Under normal circumstances, it would take 2 people working together to move the bulkhead manually. Kate grabbed the main lever and pulled with all her strength. Nothing happened. She pulled again and felt the lever move slightly. The gas was making her weaker with every breath. Her vision was starting to blur and she could taste blood in her mouth. Through the yellow haze, she could see Marcus and the others pushing on the bulkhead from their side. Darius had somehow gotten the electronic system partially working, and the bulkhead was getting power but not enough. They needed the manual hydraulics to provide the extra force. Kate braced her feet against the wall and pulled the lever again. This time she felt it move. The bulkhead shifted another few centimeters. It still was not enough. Kate's legs were shaking and she could barely stand. She pulled again and each time the bulkhead moved a little more. She lost track of how many times she pulled the lever. Everything became about the next pull and the next breath and trying not to collapse. Her hands were bleeding from gripping the lever so hard. Her lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. But she kept pulling because 8 men were depending on her, and for the first time in her life she was not going to let people down just because of the color of their skin. Finally, the bulkhead moved enough to create an opening that someone could fit through. Kate heard Marcus shouting instructions through her helmet speaker. He was organizing the evacuation. The 2 unconscious inmates went through, first carried by the others. Then the inmates with the weakest breathing masks went through. Kate watched them disappear into the safe zone on the other side of the bulkhead. She felt satisfaction mixed with the pain. They were going to make it. At least most of them would make it. Kate's vision was fading now. She could not see clearly anymore and her legs finally gave out. She slid down the wall to the floor, still holding the hydraulic lever to keep the bulkhead open. She wondered if this was how she was going to die. Alone in a corridor full of poison gas after saving the lives of men she had hated. It seemed like a strange ending to her story. She thought about her parents and wondered what they would think if they knew what she had done. They would probably say she was a traitor to her race. They would say she threw her life away for criminals who did not deserve saving. But Kate did not care anymore what her parents thought. She did not care what anyone thought. She had made a choice and it was hers alone. For the first time in her life, she had done something that was truly right even though it cost her everything. Kate's eyes closed and she felt herself falling into darkness. She did not feel the hands that grabbed her or the voices shouting her name. She did not feel herself being dragged through the bulkhead opening. She did not know that Marcus had come back through the gap to pull her to safety. She did not know that he took off her helmet and put it back on her head, even though he was suffocating without it. She did not know any of this because she was already unconscious. But somewhere deep in her fading mind, she felt something she had not felt in decades. She felt peace. Kate woke up 3 days later in the medical wing of Facility 7. The first thing she noticed was that breathing hurt. Every breath felt like someone was scraping the inside of her lungs with sandpaper. Her throat was raw and her chest ached with a deep, persistent pain. She tried to sit up, but her body would not cooperate. A nurse appeared at her bedside and gently pushed her back down. The nurse told her to stay still and rest. Kate's voice came out as a harsh whisper when she asked what happened. The nurse explained that Kate had suffered severe chemical burns to her lungs and respiratory system. The doctors had used advanced regeneration therapy to repair most of the damage, but complete healing would take weeks. Kate asked about the inmates. The nurse smiled and said all 8 men had survived. Kate felt tears running down her face, and she did not understand why she was crying. The nurse patted her hand and told her she was a hero. Kate shook her head weakly. She was not a hero. She was just someone who had finally done the right thing after a lifetime of doing wrong. Warden Phillips visited her later that afternoon. He pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down with a heavy sigh. He looked older than Kate remembered, and there were new lines of worry on his face. He told her that the breach in Section C had been catastrophic, and that if she had not helped open the bulkhead, all 8 inmates would have died. He said Marcus Cole had spent 2 hours in critical condition after pulling her to safety. The doctor said Marcus should have died from oxygen deprivation, but he had refused to give up. Phillips handed Kate a tablet computer and told her she needed to see something. Kate took the tablet with shaking hands and looked at the screen. It showed security camera footage from Section C. She watched herself remove her helmet and give it to Marcus. She watched herself work the hydraulic controls while suffocating on toxic gas. She watched Marcus come back through the bulkhead opening to drag her unconscious body to safety. She watched the other inmates help even though they were barely conscious themselves. The footage was shaky and filled with yellow gas, but the message was clear. 8 men who owed her nothing had chosen to save her life after. She had treated them with nothing but contempt. Phillips told her the footage had been released to the public and had gone viral across all the human colonies. Millions of people had watched it. News organizations were calling it the Europa miracle. People were saying it proved that humanity's capacity for good could overcome even the deepest prejudices. Kate looked at Phillips and asked why they had saved her. Phillips smiled sadly and said that was a question she should ask Marcus herself. Marcus came to visit Kate the next day. He walked slowly into the medical wing, and Kate could see he was still recovering too. His breathing was labored, and he moved carefully like someone whose body was not yet fully healed. He stood at the foot of her bed for a moment, just looking at her. Kate found she could not meet his eyes. She stared at her hands instead and felt shame burning through her. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." Marcus pulled up a chair and sat down. He said she was welcome, but his voice was neutral. Kate forced herself to look at him. She told him she did not deserve to be saved. She said she had treated him and all the others like garbage. She said she had been racist and cruel and wrong about everything. Her voice broke and tears started flowing again. Marcus waited until she was quiet, and then he spoke. He said she had made a choice in that corridor. Maybe it was the first real choice she had made in years. What mattered now was what she did next. Kate asked him how she could possibly fix 30 years of being wrong. How could she make up for all the harm she had caused? Marcus leaned forward, and his expression was serious. He told her she could start by listening. Really listening to the stories of the men in this prison. She could look at the laws that put them here and ask herself if those laws were just. She could use her privilege and her position to change things instead of enforcing a broken system. He said her transformation was not about redemption for herself. It was about justice for everyone. Kate nodded slowly. She understood what he was saying. This was not about making herself feel better. This was about taking responsibility and doing the hard work to repair damage that went far beyond her personal actions. Over the next few weeks, while Kate recovered, she started reading. Phillips brought her access to all the case files for every inmate in Facility 7. Kate read them one by one, and what she learned broke her heart. Darius Wright had been convicted for hacking corporate computer systems, but what he actually did was expose environmental crimes that were killing thousands of people. The corporations controlled the courts, and Darius was sent to prison, while the executives who caused the deaths went free. Jerome Baker had organized a workers' strike to demand basic safety equipment after 3 of his co-workers died in preventable accidents. He was arrested for colonial sabotage and sentenced to 20 years. Andre Simpson was a teacher who refused to implement a new curriculum that taught false history about racial superiority. He was convicted of corrupting youth and lost his career. Calvin Hughes had participated in a peaceful protest against unfair housing laws. The protest was legal, but police attacked the protesters, and Calvin defended a pregnant woman who was being beaten. He was convicted of assaulting an officer. The pattern was the same in case after case. These men were not criminals in any real sense. They were political prisoners and scapegoats and victims of a corrupt system. Kate had spent her career enforcing that system. She had been the weapon that the powerful used against the powerless. This realization made her physically sick. Marcus's case was particularly devastating. Kate read the full trial transcript and the police reports and the witness statements. Marcus had been leading a peaceful protest against the Colonial Resource Act, which allowed corporations to seize land from immigrant communities. The protest was completely legal and had all the required permits. Corporate security forces showed up and started beating protesters without provocation. Marcus and others defended themselves and protected people who were being hurt. The security camera footage clearly showed that the corporate forces initiated the violence. But somehow Marcus and 47 other protesters were convicted of assault, while the corporate security forces received commendations for their service. Kate sat in her hospital bed reading this and felt rage building inside her. Not rage at Marcus, but rage at the system. Rage at the judges and lawyers and politicians who had allowed this to happen. Rage at herself for being part of it for so long. She called for Phillips, and when he arrived, she asked him how many cases like this existed in the colonial justice system. Phillips looked tired when he answered. He said thousands, maybe tens of thousands. The whole system was designed to remove troublesome voices and provide cheap labor for corporate colonies. Everyone in the prison system knew it, but no one talked about it, because challenging the system meant losing your job or worse. Kate was released from medical care 6 weeks after the breach. Her lungs were scarred but functional. The doctors told her she would have breathing problems for the rest of her life, but she would survive. Kate returned to her duties as a guard, but everything looked different now. The inmates were not criminals anymore. They were people who had been failed by every institution that was supposed to protect them. The prison was not a place of justice. It was a warehouse for human beings that society wanted to forget. Kate knew she could not fix this alone, but she could start making small changes. She stopped the verbal harassment that she had normalized. When she saw other guards using excessive force, she reported them. She advocated for better conditions and more humane treatment. The inmates noticed. They did not trust her yet, but the open hostility faded into cautious observation. Some of them started greeting her respectfully in the halls. A few even smiled at her. These small gestures meant more to Kate than any commendation or award ever had. She was starting to understand what it meant to treat people with dignity. She was starting to understand what she had been missing her entire life. 2 months after the breach, Kate did something that changed everything. She contacted Luna Santiago, who was an investigative journalist famous for exposing colonial corruption. Kate told Santiago she had documentation of wrongful convictions and systemic abuse in the prison system. She said she was willing to testify publicly about what she had seen and done. Santiago was skeptical at first. She had been burned before by sources who promised evidence and then disappeared, but Kate was persistent. She provided Santiago with copies of case files and internal memos and prison records. Everything was protected by whistleblower laws that Phillips quietly helped Kate navigate. Phillips knew that exposing the truth would bring trouble to Facility 7, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. Santiago spent 3 months investigating and verifying Kate's information. She interviewed other guards and former inmates and legal experts. She built an airtight case that the colonial justice system was fundamentally corrupt. When Santiago finally published her expose, it was the biggest story of the year. The article was titled "The Europa Files: How the Colonial Justice System Creates Criminals." It dominated news feeds across every human colony. Kate's testimony, backed by her insider knowledge. The backlash against Kate started within hours of the expose being published. Her personal communication device exploded with messages from her family and former colleagues. Her parents sent her a message disowning her and saying she was a traitor to her race and her family. Her sister called her every horrible name imaginable. Former guards she had worked with on Mars threatened her and said she should watch her back. The Purity Movement, which was a large political organization in the colonies, put out a statement calling Kate a liar and a criminal sympathizer. They organized protests demanding she be fired and arrested. Kate read all these messages and felt surprisingly little pain. These people had taught her to hate, and she had finally learned to reject their teachings. Losing their approval meant she was on the right path. The harder part was dealing with the guilt. Every night, Kate lay awake thinking about all the people she had hurt during her 30-year career. She thought about inmates she had beaten or humiliated. She thought about families she had helped destroy. She wondered how many innocent people had suffered because of her actions. The guilt was crushing, but Marcus told her it was necessary. He said guilt without action was just self-pity. The only way to honor the people she had hurt was to make sure no one else suffered the same way. But something unexpected happened as the backlash grew. Millions of ordinary people across the colony started speaking up in support of Kate and the investigation. The footage of Marcus saving his racist guard had already changed how many people thought about criminals and punishment. Now the documented evidence of systemic corruption made it impossible to ignore the truth. Protests erupted on Mars and Europa and even Earth. People who had never thought much about the prison system started demanding answers. Why were so many people in prison for non-violent offenses? Why were corporate executives never prosecuted for crimes that killed thousands? Why did the justice system seem designed to target poor people and minorities? The Colonial Council tried to dismiss the protests at first. They said Kate was just a disgruntled employee making up lies. They said the inmates were criminals who deserved their sentences. But the evidence was too strong and the public anger was too widespread. The council was forced to establish an independent review commission to investigate the colonial justice system. Marcus was appointed to the commission while still serving his prison sentence. His presence on the commission gave it credibility because everyone knew he had first-hand experience with injustice. The review commission worked for 8 months examining thousands of cases. What they found shocked even people who thought they understood how corrupt the system was. More than 60% of inmates in colonial prisons had been convicted under laws that were designed to criminalize poverty and political dissent. Many had been denied adequate legal representation. Some had been tortured or coerced into false confessions. Corporate influence over judges and prosecutors was widespread and systematic. The commission's final report was 1,200 pages long, and it recommended sweeping changes to every level of the justice system. Within a year, reforms began to be implemented. Mandatory body cameras for all guards, independent review boards for use of force incidents, elimination of prison labor quotas, prosecution of officials who had abused their power. Most importantly, a complete review of every conviction in the colonial prison system. Cases would be examined by independent judges who had no connection to the original trials. Inmates who had been wrongfully convicted would be released and compensated. The reforms were not perfect, and implementation was slow, but they represented real change. Kate watched all of this happen and felt a strange mixture of hope and sorrow. She was glad the system was being fixed, but she knew it was too late for too many people. Facility 7 became a test case for the new approach to corrections. Instead of punishment, the focus shifted to rehabilitation and education. Inmates were given access to real job training and college courses. Mental health services were expanded. Family visitation rules were relaxed. The physical environment was improved with better food and living conditions. Most importantly, inmates were given a voice in how the facility operated. Marcus led a committee of prisoners who worked with the administration to develop new policies. Kate found herself working alongside this committee, and it was uncomfortable at first. She had to sit in meetings with men she had once abused and listen to them talk about how to make things better. She had to accept criticism about old policies she had enforced. She had to learn to see the inmates as partners rather than subordinates. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but also the most important. Slowly, she learned to listen without getting defensive. She learned to accept that her experience as a guard did not make her an expert on what inmates needed. She learned to step back and let others lead. Not everyone at Facility 7 supported the changes. Several guards quit rather than adapt to the new system. They complained that treating inmates with respect made the prison too soft and dangerous. Kate understood their thinking because she used to think the same way. But the data proved them wrong. Violence in the facility dropped by 70% in the first year of reforms. Suicide attempts nearly disappeared. Inmates engaged more positively with programs and education. The facility became safer for everyone, because people were treated like human beings instead of animals. Some guards embraced the changes enthusiastically. Kenny and Lisa, who had criticized Kate in her early days, became leaders in implementing the new training programs. They taught other guards about de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. They organized workshops where inmates and guards could talk openly about their experiences. Kate attended these workshops and usually said very little. She was there to learn, not to teach. One day during a workshop, an inmate named Calvin Hughes spoke about his first week in prison. He described how a guard had beaten him for making eye contact. He described the fear and humiliation he felt. Then Calvin looked directly at Kate and said, "That guard was you." The room went silent. Kate felt everyone's eyes on her. She wanted to run away, but she stayed in her seat. She looked at Calvin and said, "Yes, it was me, and I am sorry." Calvin nodded slowly. He said he did not forgive her yet, but he appreciated the honesty. That was enough for now. 2 years after the breach, Kate sat in the facility's common area during recreation hour. The area looked different now. The guards and inmates were no longer strictly separated. Small groups mixed together playing cards or chess or just talking. Kate sat at a table with Marcus, who was teaching her how to play chess properly. She was terrible at it, but she enjoyed the lessons because they gave her time to talk with Marcus about everything she was learning. Darius and several other inmates sat nearby working on a proposal for a new water recycling system that would make Facility 7 more sustainable. The conversation was technical and enthusiastic and had nothing to do with being in prison. These men were using their skills and knowledge to solve real problems. Jerome was across the room teaching a literacy class to younger inmates. Andre was helping someone fill out college application forms. The prison still looked like a prison with its metal walls and locked doors, but the atmosphere was completely different. There was hope here now. There was dignity. Kate looked around the common area and felt something she never expected to feel in a place like this. She felt like she belonged, not because she was a guard with authority over inmates, but because she was part of a community of people who were all trying to become better versions of themselves. Marcus moved his queen across the chessboard and said, "Checkmate." Kate looked at the board and laughed. She told him he was still teaching her lessons with every game. Marcus smiled and said that was what people did for those they cared about. Kate felt tears starting, but she blinked them back. She asked Marcus if he would ever really forgive her for how she treated him. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said forgiveness was complicated. He said Kate had made real changes and was doing real work to fix the damage she helped cause. That mattered, but forgiveness was not something she could earn or deserve. It was something he might choose to give someday when he was ready. For now, they could work together toward justice. That was enough. Kate nodded. She understood that her transformation was not about making herself feel better. It was about making things better for everyone. Marcus reminded her that she should not make her personal redemption the center of the story. The real story was about the broken system and how it was being repaired. The real heroes were not her or even Marcus. The real heroes were the hundreds of people who had maintained their humanity despite everything the system did to strip it away. Kate agreed. She had been given a chance to be part of something bigger than herself. A chance to help build something better. She was not going to waste it by making it all about her guilt or her growth. She was going to focus on the work that still needed to be done. 3 years after the Europa breach, the colonial justice system looked radically different from what it had been. The conviction review process was releasing wrongfully imprisoned people every week. Of the original 300 inmates at Facility 7, more than 200 had been released after their cases were examined by independent judges. Many received formal apologies and financial compensation from the government. The compensation was never enough to make up for stolen years and broken families, but it was at least an acknowledgement that terrible wrongs had been done. Marcus Cole was among those released. His conviction was overturned completely and all records of it were erased. The judge who reviewed his case wrote a blistering opinion condemning the original trial as a mockery of justice. Marcus was offered a position as director of the Colonial Rehabilitation Initiative, which was a new government agency tasked with reforming the entire corrections system. He accepted the position and immediately began hiring other formerly incarcerated people to key roles. He believed that people who had experienced the system's failures were best positioned to fix it. Kate watched Marcus's rise from prison inmate to government director and felt pride mixed with sadness. Pride because Marcus deserved recognition for his wisdom and leadership. Sadness because he should never have been in prison in the first place. Darius Wright was also released and became the lead technical advisor for the Colonial Prison Safety Board. His experience as both an engineer and an inmate gave him unique insight into how to make prisons safer. He designed new systems for air quality monitoring and emergency response that were being installed in facilities across human space. Jerome Baker returned to organizing labor unions, and within a year, he had won major victories for worker rights on 3 different colonies. Andre Simpson went back to teaching, but now he also trained other teachers on how to recognize and resist discriminatory curricula. Calvin Hughes became a lawyer specializing in wrongful conviction cases. He was fierce in court and had already freed dozens of people from unjust sentences. These men had been labeled criminals by society, but now they were leaders making the colonies better for everyone. Kate followed their work closely and supported them however she could. Sometimes that meant testifying in court cases. Sometimes it meant speaking at conferences about her experiences. Sometimes it just meant staying out of their way and letting them lead. Kate's own role had changed significantly. She was no longer a regular guard at Facility 7. Instead, she became the lead instructor for the new guard training academy that Marcus had created. The academy taught a completely different approach to corrections based on dignity and rehabilitation, rather than punishment and control. Kate's job was to train new guards and retrain existing ones. It was difficult work because many people came to the academy with the same prejudices Kate had once held. She had to find ways to break through their assumptions without being preachy or judgmental. She did this by being brutally honest about her own past. In every training session, Kate started by telling her story. She explained how she had been raised to hate. She described the cruel things she had done to inmates. She showed footage of herself from before the breach and let trainees see how her face looked when she was filled with contempt. Then she showed footage from the breach itself. She made trainees watch as she removed her helmet and as Marcus came back to save her. She explained what she learned and how hard it was to change. Most importantly, she told trainees that her transformation did not make her a hero. It just made her someone who had finally stopped being a villain. This honesty was powerful. Trainees could not dismiss her as naive or soft because she had lived the life they were living. When she told them they were wrong about inmates, they had to listen because she had been wrong in exactly the same ways. The academy brought in formerly incarcerated people to teach alongside Kate. These instructors shared their experiences of being dehumanized by guards and explained how that trauma affected them. They described what good guards did differently. They taught de-escalation techniques and cultural competency and trauma-informed care. The curriculum was demanding and some trainees dropped out because they could not handle having their beliefs challenged. But those who completed the program emerged as a new generation of corrections officers who understood that their job was to support rehabilitation, not inflict punishment. Kate was proud of these graduates and stayed in touch with many of them. They would send her messages from their facilities describing how they handled difficult situations using what they learned. Sometimes they asked for advice when they faced ethical dilemmas. Kate always answered honestly and reminded them that doing the right thing was often uncomfortable. She told them about her own ongoing struggles with guilt and change. She wanted them to understand that becoming better was not a destination, but a continuous process. 5 years after the breach, the Colonial Council announced first contact with an alien civilization. The Zetharian Collective had been observing humanity for decades from just outside the solar system. They possessed technology far beyond anything humans had developed and could have destroyed human civilization easily, if they chose to. But the Zetharians were peaceful and curious. They wanted to understand humanity before deciding whether to welcome humans into the galactic community. The Zetharians sent a delegation to meet with human leaders, and the first interstellar summit was scheduled on Europa. Kate learned that Marcus had been chosen as one of Earth's representatives at the summit. This made sense because Marcus had become one of the most respected voices on questions of justice and human rights. Kate watched the summit coverage on news feeds along with billions of other humans. The meeting hall was filled with dignitaries from Earth and Mars and the various colony worlds. The Zetharian delegates were tall beings with forearms and skin that changed colors based on their emotions. They communicated through a combination of sounds and color patterns that were translated by advanced computers. The lead Zetharian delegate asked humanity to explain what made their species worthy of joining the galactic community. Various human representatives gave speeches about technological achievements and cultural diversity and democratic values. These speeches were fine, but they felt hollow to Kate. They focused on humanity's best qualities while ignoring the darkness. Then Marcus stood to speak, and Kate leaned forward to watch more closely. Marcus did not talk about human achievements. Instead, he told the story of Facility 7. He described the corrupt justice system that had imprisoned innocent people. He described Kate as a guard who had been raised to hate and who enforced that broken system for 30 years. He described the breach and how Kate made a choice to save people she had been taught to despise. He described how he and the other inmates chose to save Kate even though she did not deserve it. Then Marcus explained what happened after that moment. He talked about the investigation and the reforms and the hundreds of people who were freed from wrongful imprisonment. He talked about how millions of ordinary humans had demanded justice when they learned the truth. Marcus looked directly at the Zetharian delegates and said that humanity was not defined by its worst moments, but by what humans did after those moments. He said humans were capable of terrible evil, but they were also capable of recognizing that evil and fighting to end it. He said humanity's capacity for change was what made them worthy of joining the galactic community. The Zetharian delegate's skin shifted through several colors that the translation computers identified as contemplation and approval. The lead delegate said the Zetharians had indeed been watching humanity for a long time. They had seen wars and oppression and environmental destruction. They had almost decided that humans were too violent and primitive to join the galactic community. But then they observed what happened after the Europa breach. They watched as humans across all colonies began questioning their justice system. They watched as reforms were implemented, despite fierce resistance from those who benefited from the old system. They watched as formerly oppressed people rose to positions of leadership. The Zetharians said these changes convinced them that humanity had the most important quality for any civilization: the ability to grow and change and become better. The lead delegate announced that the Zetharian collective would sponsor humanity's application to join the galactic community. There were conditions and probation periods, but the message was clear. Humanity was being welcomed to the stars. Kate watched Marcus receive congratulations from human and alien representatives alike, and she cried. Not tears of joy exactly, but tears of relief. Relief that humanity's worst impulses had not defined them forever. Relief that the suffering of people like Marcus had not been meaningless. Relief that maybe there was hope for all of them. After the first contact summit, humanity entered a new era. The Zetharians shared some of their technology with humans, including faster communication systems and more efficient energy sources. But more importantly, they shared knowledge about how other civilizations governed themselves and resolved conflicts. Human leaders studied these examples and used them to continue reforming their own systems. The colonial justice reforms expanded and deepened. New laws were passed that made it much harder to imprison people for political activity or poverty-related offenses. Corporate influence over courts was reduced through strict regulations and oversight. Public defenders received more funding and training so that poor people could get real legal representation. The changes were not perfect, and there was still resistance from those who benefited from the old system. But the direction was clear. Humanity was slowly building a justice system that actually served justice rather than power. Kate continued her work at the Guard Training Academy and watched these changes with cautious optimism. She knew that systems could be reformed, but individual prejudices were harder to change. Every new class of trainees included people who came with deeply ingrained biases. Kate's job was to help them see past those biases without making them feel attacked or defensive. It was delicate work that required patience and honesty. One day, a young trainee named Paul Henderson challenged Kate during a class discussion. Paul had grown up in a purity movement community, and his worldview was similar to what Kate's had been. He argued that some people were naturally more criminal than others, and that strict punishment was the only thing they understood. Kate recognized Paul's arguments because she had made them herself for 30 years. She asked Paul if he had ever actually known any of the people he was talking about. Paul admitted he had not. Kate pulled up footage from the breach and made the class watch it in silence. When the footage ended, she asked Paul what he saw. Paul said reluctantly that he saw inmates saving a guard who did not deserve it. Kate nodded and told Paul that those inmates had every reason to let her die. She had treated them cruelly, and she represented a system that had stolen years of their lives, but they saved her anyway because they were better people than she was. She told Paul that if he wanted to be a good guard, he needed to understand that the people in his care were human beings capable of nobility and compassion. She said the job of a guard was not to punish but to protect and support. Some trainees like Paul needed many such conversations before their thinking started to shift. Kate was patient with them because she remembered how hard it had been for her to change. Marcus visited the academy occasionally to give guest lectures. Kate always attended these lectures and sat in the back of the room listening. Marcus talked about his time in prison and what it felt like to be treated as less than human. He talked about the importance of maintaining dignity, even when people tried to strip it away. He talked about forgiveness and justice and the difference between the two. After one lecture, a trainee asked Marcus if he had forgiven Kate for how she treated him. The room went silent and everyone looked at Marcus. Kate felt her heart pounding because she had wondered the same thing many times. Marcus thought for a long moment before answering. He said forgiveness was personal and complicated. He said Kate had done real work to change and to help reform the system. That work mattered and Marcus respected it, but forgiveness was not something Kate could earn through good deeds. It was something Marcus might choose to give when and if he felt ready. He said what mattered more than his personal forgiveness was whether Kate continued to do the work of justice. Kate understood what Marcus meant. She was not entitled to his forgiveness, and she should not make her need for it the center of their relationship. What mattered was the work they were both doing to make sure no one else had to suffer what Marcus suffered. Kate's personal life remained difficult, even as her professional life found new purpose. She had no relationship with her family, and most of her old friends had cut ties with her. The purity movement still targeted her with harassment and occasional threats. Kate accepted this as part of the cost of change. She had allies now among the reform community and among formerly incarcerated people who appreciated her honesty about her past. These new relationships were more meaningful than her old ones had been, because they were based on shared values rather than shared prejudices. Kate lived alone in a small apartment near the academy. Her evenings were quiet and often lonely. She spent them reading or preparing lessons or corresponding with graduates of the academy. Sometimes she allowed herself to think about what her life might have been like if she had never worked in corrections, if she had chosen a different career, or challenged her upbringing earlier. But she knew these thoughts were pointless. She could not change the past. She could only work to make the future better. On bad nights when the guilt became overwhelming, Kate would watch footage from the breach. Not to congratulate herself on making a good choice, but to remember what Marcus and the others had done. They had shown her what real strength looked like. They had given her a chance to become better. The least she could do was honor that chance by continuing to work for change. 7 years after the breach, Kate received an unexpected message. It was from her younger niece Claire, who Kate had not spoken to since her family disowned her. Claire was now 23 years old, and the message said she had been following Kate's work from a distance. Claire wrote that she had grown up believing the same things Kate used to believe, but that watching Kate's transformation had made her question everything. Claire said she was studying criminal justice in college and wanted to become a reform advocate. She asked if Kate would be willing to meet with her. Kate read the message 3 times before responding. She agreed to meet Claire, but warned her that it might damage Claire's relationship with the rest of the family. Claire wrote back saying she was prepared for that. They met at a small cafe on Europa and talked for 4 hours. Claire asked Kate how she had found the strength to admit she was wrong. Kate said it was not strength but necessity. She said the universe had forced her to see the truth and she could either accept it or live in delusion. Claire asked if Kate was happy now. Kate thought about this question carefully. She said she was not happy exactly, but she was at peace. She had a purpose and she was doing work that mattered. That was more valuable than happiness. Claire hugged Kate when they said goodbye and promised to stay in touch. Kate walked back to her apartment feeling lighter than she had in years. Maybe redemption was not about earning forgiveness from those you hurt. Maybe it was about inspiring others to be better than you were. As humanity spread further into the galaxy, the reforms that started with the Europa investigation became a model for other civilizations. The Zetharians introduced human representatives to dozens of alien species, and many of them were impressed by humanity's willingness to acknowledge and fix systemic injustice. Some alien civilizations had their own versions of corrupt systems, and they studied the human reforms to guide their own changes. Marcus became humanity's unofficial ambassador to these civilizations. He traveled to alien worlds and shared the story of Facility 7. He explained how ordinary people had demanded change, and how that change had rippled through all of human society. Alien leaders listened carefully because Marcus spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through injustice. He did not preach or lecture. He simply told the truth about what happened and let others draw their own conclusions. Kate followed Marcus's diplomatic work through news reports and felt pride in his accomplishments. She also felt a strange kind of gratitude. Marcus could have spent his freedom being angry and bitter. He had earned that right. Instead, he chose to use his experience to help others. This choice inspired Kate to keep doing her own work even when it was hard. If Marcus could move forward after everything he suffered, then Kate had no excuse for giving up. 10 years after the breach, the Colonial Council established a permanent memorial at Facility 7. The memorial honored all the people who had been wrongfully imprisoned in the colonial justice system. It included a wall with thousands of names carved into black stone. Marcus's name was there along with Darius and Jerome and Andre and Calvin and all the others from that day in Section C. Kate attended the dedication ceremony, but stayed in the back of the crowd. She did not feel she had any right to be prominent at an event honoring the people she had helped oppress. But Marcus saw her and called her forward. He asked her to speak about what the memorial meant. Kate was reluctant, but Marcus insisted. She stood before the crowd and looked at all those names on the wall. She said these were people who had maintained their humanity in a system designed to destroy it. She said they were the real heroes of this story. She said everyone present had a responsibility to make sure such injustice never happened again. Her voice shook as she spoke and tears ran down her face. When she finished, Marcus embraced her and the crowd applauded. Kate knew the applause was not for her. It was for the long, difficult work of justice that was still ongoing. Work that required everyone to keep pushing forward even when progress was slow and painful. 15 years after the breach, Kate stood at the window of her small office at the Guard Training Academy and looked out at Europa's frozen surface. Jupiter hung huge in the black sky, and its light reflected off the ice, creating strange, beautiful patterns. Kate was 67 years old now, and her hair had gone completely gray. The scars on her lungs from that day in Section C still caused her pain, and she tired more easily than she used to. But she continued teaching because the work was too important to stop. The academy had trained thousands of guards over the past decade, and most facilities across human space now operated using the rehabilitation model. Violence in prisons had dropped by 80%. Recidivism rates had fallen dramatically. Most importantly, people who were incarcerated were treated with basic dignity. The changes were real and measurable. But Kate knew that systems could always slide backward if people stopped paying attention. Every generation needed to learn why justice mattered, and how easily it could be corrupted. That was why her work at the academy was so important. She was teaching the next generation to be better than she had been. Marcus Cole had recently been appointed as the first director of the Galactic Justice Initiative, which was a new organization that helped civilizations across known space reform their legal systems. It was a prestigious position that recognized Marcus as one of the leading voices on justice reform in the galaxy. Marcus had asked Kate to join the initiative as a senior advisor, but Kate had declined. She told Marcus that her place was here at the academy teaching guards. She was good at this work, and she believed it was where she could do the most good. Marcus accepted her decision without argument. He understood that everyone had to find their own way to contribute. But Marcus still visited the academy several times a year when his travel schedule allowed. These visits had become important to both of them. They would sit in Kate's office and talk about the progress being made and the challenges that remained. They would play chess, and Marcus would almost always win. They had developed a friendship that was complicated and imperfect but real. Kate no longer asked if Marcus had forgiven her. She had learned that forgiveness was not the point. What mattered was that they trusted each other to continue doing the work of justice. The other men from Section C had also found their paths. Darius Wright now led the design team for the new generation of space stations that would house humanity's expansion into deep space. His designs prioritized safety and dignity for all inhabitants. Jerome Baker had become a senator in the Colonial Council and was known as a fierce advocate for workers' rights and economic justice. Andre Simpson ran the largest teacher training program in human space, and his methods were being adopted on dozens of worlds. Calvin Hughes was Chief Justice of the Colonial Supreme Court and had written several landmark decisions protecting civil rights. These men had taken the suffering they experienced and transformed it into leadership that benefited millions. Kate followed their work and supported it however she could. Sometimes that meant testifying before Jerome's committee about prison conditions. Sometimes it meant consulting with Darius on facility design. Sometimes it just meant sending a message of encouragement when one of them faced a difficult challenge. Kate's role was always supportive rather than central. She had learned to take up less space and let others lead. The footage from the breach had become part of humanity's shared history. Children across human space studied it in school. The moment when Kate removed her helmet was analyzed in ethics classes. The moment when Marcus came back to save her was discussed in leadership courses. The story had taken on meanings that went beyond the individuals involved. For some people, it represented humanity's capacity for change. For others, it represented the power of grace and forgiveness. For others, it was a reminder that justice required constant vigilance. Kate was uncomfortable with how the story had been mythologized. She worried that people focused too much on her individual transformation and not enough on the systemic problems that had caused the situation. She gave interviews occasionally, and she always tried to redirect attention away from herself and toward the larger issues. She talked about the thousands of people who were still fighting for justice. She talked about the work that still needed to be done. She talked about how easy it would be for humanity to slip back into old patterns of oppression if they became complacent. Most interviewers wanted to hear about her dramatic personal change, but Kate refused to give them a simple redemption story. Real change was messy and incomplete and ongoing. That was the truth she insisted on telling. Kate's niece Claire had become one of the leading researchers on restorative justice and had published several influential papers. Claire often credited Kate with inspiring her career choice, but Kate always felt strange about this. She had not set out to inspire anyone. She had simply been forced to confront her own evil and had chosen to try to do better. But Claire insisted that Kate's willingness to admit fault and change course was powerful, precisely because it was so rare. Most people who realized they had been wrong spent their energy defending their past choices.
Kate had done the opposite.
She had acknowledged her wrongdoing publicly and then spent the rest of her life trying to repair the damage. Claire said this model of accountability was what society needed more of. Kate appreciated Claire's perspective, but she still struggled with being held up as any kind of example. She knew how close she had come to leaving those men to die in Section C. She knew how much of her change was driven by shame and necessity rather than moral courage. She worried that people saw her as better than she actually was. On the 20th anniversary of the breach, Facility 7 held a special ceremony. All surviving participants were invited to return, including the guards who had been on duty that day and the inmates who had been in Section C. Kate arrived early and walked through the facility, which looked very different now. The old sections had been renovated with better lighting and more open spaces. The cells had been replaced with small apartments. The common areas felt welcoming rather than oppressive. Current residents of the facility were finishing college degrees and learning skilled trades. Many would be released soon with real opportunities waiting for them. This was what justice could look like when it was done right. Kate stood in the corridor where the breach had occurred. The cracks in the wall had been repaired long ago, but a small plaque marked the spot. The plaque listed the names of everyone who had been there that day. Kate read through the names slowly. Some of these people had become famous. Others had returned to quiet lives. 2 had passed away in the years since, but all of them had been changed by what happened here. All of them carried the memory of that moment when death seemed certain and grace proved possible. The ceremony began in the main auditorium. Marcus spoke first, and his words were measured and thoughtful. He talked about how that day in Section C had revealed both the worst and best of humanity. He said the worst was the system that had put innocent people in cages. The best was what happened when people chose connection over hatred. He said the real miracle was not that they survived, but what they built afterward. He said justice was not a destination, but a practice that required constant effort. When Marcus finished speaking, Kate was called to the podium. She had not prepared formal remarks because she did not trust herself to get through a speech without breaking down. Instead, she spoke from her heart. She thanked Marcus and the others for saving her life and for saving her soul. She said she spent most of her life being wrong about everything that mattered. She said she was grateful for the chance to spend the rest of her life trying to be right. She said the work of justice was never finished and that everyone in the room had a responsibility to continue it. When she returned to her seat, Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. They had both survived that day in Section C. They had both been changed by it. And they were both committed to making sure something good came from all the suffering. After the ceremony ended, people gathered in small groups to talk and remember. Kate stood with Darius and Jerome and several others from Section C. They shared stories about what they had been doing and caught up on each other's lives. The conversation was easy and comfortable. These men had every reason to hate Kate, but instead they had welcomed her into their community. She would never fully understand why, but she was grateful for it. As the evening wore on, Kate found herself alone for a moment on an observation deck, looking out at Jupiter. She thought about the girl she had been growing up in New Atlanta. That girl had been taught so many lies and had believed all of them. She thought about the guard she had been when she first arrived at Facility 7. That guard had been cruel and broken and afraid. She thought about the woman she was now, still broken in many ways, still carrying guilt that would never fully fade, but also someone who was trying every day to be better, someone who had learned that change was possible even when it seemed impossible, someone who understood that humanity's greatest gift was not its power or its intelligence, but its ability to choose differently.